Thank you, Liza, for that kind introduction. Like the other speakers, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Dedalus Foundation, and especially Jack Flam and Katie Rogers for this grant. Years before this, I received the Dedalus dissertation grant. I keep going to the well, and the well keeps giving, so thank you so much. Motherwell has become, for me, a kind of academic godfather. To be sure, his generosity over time has enabled my formation and growth as a scholar, and for facilitating my research for this project. I thank also Christiana Dobrinsky at the Dedalus Foundation and the hardworking staffs at the Archives of American Art here in DC and at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Collections in Butler Library, where Shapiro's papers are housed. In 1929, Schapiro earned the first doctoral degree in art history granted by Columbia University. His dissertation examined the cloister and portal of the abbey in Moissac, France, built around 1100 AD. In it, he argued for the importance of the medieval artist's aesthetic choices. He gave back to the artist a sense of agency and originality. He is widely regarded as one of the greatest art historians of the 20th century for several reasons, among others, for his unique ability to master all periods from ancient to contemporary art. This has now become more and more common for senior scholars, but Schapiro was really the first. This is one of his favorite works that he would take modern artists to see. It's at the Morgan Library in New York. And it is a 10th century manuscript illustrating the apocalypse by a Spanish monk, Beatus. And you can see the way in which this is very pre-modern, or at least why Schapiro saw this as pre-modern. These bright, bold colors, these kind of large blocks which are almost abstract, and the images, if you could see them, the faces are often frontal and profile at the same time in a very Picassoid manner. This is a kind of work that for Schapiro paved the way for modern art. Also, I think he is unique because, as is evinced in these works, he was a consummate artist in his own right. He did many drawings like this, which were more technical drawings for his own studies and his own scholarship. And he did many works that were just for pleasure or for his own artistic pursuits. And also, I think he's unique because during his lifetime, he befriended, taught, helped, and supported, wrote endless rec letters for living artists who were, not surprisingly, drawn to him due to the fact that he was more approachable, humble, down to earth than other university professors. His door at Columbia was always open, not just for the many famous European artists who arrived in New York around 1940, or for not only for the up-and-coming abstract expressionists, but others less well-known, like Gandhi Brody, for example, whose extensive correspondence with Schapiro is preserved in the Archives of American Art. Given all of this, it might seem strange that I'm limiting my talk to Shapiro's relationship with Motherwell. However, to my mind, this remains a special case. They seem to mirror each other in fascinating ways. The art historian who revered practicing artists and tried to be one, and the artist who admired intellectuals and had art historical aspirations. In addition to being a visual artist, Motherwell was, like Schapiro, a man of ideas, erudite, literary, and very international. And a prolific writer, as well as an editor of an incredibly important book on Dada and Surrealist poets, first published in 1951, at a very decisive moment that I would argue, changed the course of abstract expressionism and American art at large. Robert Motherwell was also the art editor of Possibilities, and like Shapiro, he had a long-standing and profound interest in the relationship between image and text. Motherwell is also a special case because he went to Columbia as a graduate student specifically to study art history with Shapiro. In turn, it was Shapiro who urged him to be a full-time painter. Their friendship lasted throughout the decades. In 1973, 12 prints by 12 artists were made to raise money to endow a chair for Meyer Schapiro at Columbia. Motherwell contributed the one on the screen, and this worked. There is now an endowed professorship for Meyer Schapiro at Columbia. And finally, I'm interested in this because I found this rather breathtaking quote in a letter from Motherwell, which he wrote to Shapiro late in life. It reads, "What I really want to say point blank is that you, who probably do not know it, have been the most decisive person in my life." Motherwell, as we know from this centennial celebration, was born in 1915 in Aberdeen, Washington, which makes him 11 years younger than Shapiro. And we've heard about this from Professor Gilbert. I won't go into this too much, but he received his BA from Stanford, where he majored in philosophy and then studied philosophy at Harvard. When Motherwell writes Shapiro for the first time, it's on April 11th, 1940. Motherwell is teaching painting and art history classes at the University of Oregon in Eugene. He wants advice about where to study for grad school. He states that he would like to earn a PhD in art history, but adds, quote, "My interests are more philosophical and contemporary. On that score, Harvard is definitely out." So was Princeton, I think, in Motherwell's mind. There were really so few people who were interested in 20th century art at this moment, let alone contemporary art, which was not even a kind of rubric at this point, except for Shapiro. It shows the breadth of his interests. Specifically, he says he was drawn to Shapiro because of his groundbreaking essay, The Nature of Abstract Art, published in the first issue of Marxist Quarterly. It was written in response to Alfred Barr's text, which accompanied a 1936 MoMA exhibition, Cubism and Abstract Art. In his essay, Shapiro disagrees with Barr's argument that one ism begets another in a historical vacuum. Abstraction is not purely aesthetic and governed by its own laws, and/or independent of the social and the material world, nor is it a kind of passive, contemplative, theoretical exercise. This is what Shapiro argues. It exists in a social context. It is a kind of necessity. According to Shapiro, it is a critical act, a judgment in which the mind views itself vis-a-vis its relation to the outside world. At one point, Shapiro posits, quote, "Abstract art has therefore the value of a practical demonstration." And he uses practical throughout this essay. This essay would prove to be an important idea for Motherwell. Indeed, in Motherwell's 1942 essay, Notes on Mondrian and de Chirico, published in the first issue of Breton's surrealist journal, Triple V, he quotes Shapiro directly. Shapiro's views on abstract art expressed in his seminal 1937 essay are also very different from Clement Greenberg's, as outlined in Avant-Garde and Kitsch and subsequent essays. Greenberg understands abstract painting as the, quote, ineluctable conclusion of the teleological development of modern art from 1860 forward, of painting gradually purifying itself of all subject matter, literary or historical references, of painting becoming about itself, a critique of the medium itself and nothing more. Greenberg and Shapiro started out as friends. They even co-organized a show for young artists in 1950 at the Sam Coots Gallery, but their friendship didn't last. As Shapiro described it in an interview in 1992, I grew increasingly disturbed with Greenberg's dogmatic formalism, by his refusal to grant artistic intention or social context, much less iconography, any place in analysis. The problem is that Greenberg does not know how to characterize a painting. Ultimately, Shapiro has more admiration for the task and labor of the artist throughout the ages. And I would say he's very close to John Ruskin in his ideas about this. In his participation at the in a roundtable discussion at the Museum of Modern Art on October 11th, 1948, Shapiro explains that the modern artist carries a heavy burden and at times needs to be at war with himself and the world. Quote, "The creation of modern art makes certain demands upon the individual who creates it. It gives to individual experiences an enormous value beyond that of previous art. It requires, therefore, a constant searching of oneself, an attentiveness to all that one has done, and a perpetual self-renewal. In the great artist, the results of this highly individual attitude can be set up beside the great art of the past. This attitude further involves a freedom of the individual, an openness to experience, qualities we consider important not only in art, but in the broader field of life itself. It is at bottom a struggle for freedom." End of quote. A similar definition of modern art and the modern artist pervades his later 1957 article, The Liberating Quality of the Avant-Garde, where he says modern art is not only a struggle for freedom, it is something that preserves our humanity in a dehumanizing world. Once again, it's a kind of humanizing labor. In an article entitled Aesthetics and Ethics in the Writings of Robert Motherwell and Meyer Schapiro, which appeared in 1996 in the Archives of American Art Journal, scholar David Craven has pointed out the essential congruities of their two views on the role of the artist and abstract art, especially apparent in Motherwell's 1950 lecture on the New York School. Okay, back to Columbia. When Motherwell is having first contact with Shapiro. Motherwell took both Romanesque sculpture and painting and European painting since 1860 with Shapiro, along with other courses with Millard Meese, Julius Held, Margaret Bieber, and William Dinsmore. At this time, Motherwell, I'm assuming this, was inspired by Shapiro to keep his now famous Met sketchbook currently housed at the Dedalus Foundation. Notice how it makes reference to Shapiro here, and how for me, it looks very similar to some of the more technical drawings that Shapiro made throughout his career. After a year at Columbia, Motherwell decided to drop out, partly as a result of Shapiro's advice that he should pursue painting full-time. As Motherwell put it in his 1971 oral history interview for the Archives of American Art, quote, "I lived near Shapiro by chance, not on purpose, and being so innocent about how busy people are in New York, I used to paint all the time, and I'd go to his house around 10 o'clock at night once a week and show him my pictures. He was very nice to me, but finally, in a very exasperated way, he said to me, 'Look, what you want to know, painters could tell you much more quickly. And all you're dying to do is hang around with painters.' Hang around painters, sorry. So I'm going to introduce you to some." He introduced me to the Parisian Surrealists and set up for me to study with Kurt Seligman, whom he chose because he spoke English well and was a highly cultivated man and was willing to do it. And here we have Motherwell's first etching from Seligman's studio. Interestingly enough, Shapiro worked together with Seligman a few years later to create this series, this book Shapiro wrote the text, he actually summarized the Oedipus myth for Seligman, and Seligman provided the illustrations. During the summer of 1941, Motherwell traveled to Mexico with Chilean surrealist Roberto Mata and his wife, and there he started his first mature painting, La Belle Mexicaine, Maria, and a series of drawings called the Mexican Sketchbook, representing his interest in the use of the technique of automatism. All the while, he's growing closer to Shapiro. And I have to ask Jack Flam and others in this room if this is the only portrait that Motherwell ever did. I had that on my mind as I was coming here. So maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A session. So after his return from Mexico on September 25th, Motherwell writes to Shapiro from Massachusetts and says, quote, "Yours is the only judgment that I wholly trust in regard to what I value. I have adopted you from afar as a kind of godfather. This summer I am finding myself as a painter. Thank you for showing interest in my painting." Motherwell continues, "Trotsky's history made a deep impression on me this summer, and I made an image of his murder," which we see on the screen. A few years later, Shapiro writes to Motherwell in what I would call quite an amazing tough love letter after Motherwell takes a teaching position at Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina. The letter is dated August 31st, 1945, so this is rather early in the history of Black Mountain College, before many of these other artists that we see on the screen go there, before it becomes really more famous. And this letter that Shapiro writes him, I think, is really worth quoting at length. Here are some more pictures from Black Mountain College. It shows the kind of more experimental, playful aspects of this and collaborative efforts that were going on. Here was Robert Motherwell teaching at Black Mountain College. Tim showed us this as well, and it's in the show down the hall. Here's the letter from Shapiro. "I wondered why you'd accepted to teach there after what you had solemnly told me last year about your resolution not to divert yourself from your painting. To labor on a farm or to do any kind of manual work would be a healthier distraction, I think." Again, that sounds like Ruskin to me. It wouldn't affect your relation to painting being simply another task which might even strengthen you for art by giving you new impressions and experiences. Whereas the kind of teaching you will have to do in these modernistic schools is a real engagement of your personality in a problematic, shallow activity to which you can't give yourself fully without risk and without a great deal of rationalization and self-accounting that breed in time 100 little excuses and regrets. And that, I'm sure, isn't what you want. I believe it holds true of artists who are unsure of themselves, who have a tendency to theorizing. That would be Motherwell. And who are not naively set in their habit of work, in an artisan spirit. And then there's this last line that's very interesting to me. Shapiro writes, "This is evident also in painting, as one can see from those amateurs like myself, who are satisfied to make sketches which they don't develop into works of a larger and richer scale." This is extremely interesting to me because I think that Shapiro, in a sense, is projecting his own fears and hopes onto Motherwell. At this early point, Meyer Schapiro was a writer of essays. He had not, and really never did, write the large art historical monograph or tome. So he's a kind of writer of sketches. And it's also interesting because Shapiro is telling the artist not to get distracted by teaching. All right, never do that. But admits that he's a teacher who gets distracted by his painting. Shapiro continued to support Motherwell as he developed his mature style, which comes out of his illustration of Harold Rosenberg's poem that was published in the artist-run periodical Possibilities. Motherwell and Rosenberg wrote an editorial preface which included the quote, "This is a magazine of artists and writers who practice in their work their own experiences without seeking to transcend it in an academic group or political formulas. Whoever genuinely believes he knows how to save humanity from catastrophe has a job before him, which is certainly not a part-time one." And again, I think this echoes Shapiro's emphasis on work that we see in the nature of abstract art. As you know, Motherwell eventually gets rid of the text and begins his elegy series. January 21st, 1948, Motherwell writes to Schapiro, "You showed me constant work is the only way." And in 1950, architect Percival Goodman asked Motherwell to create a mural for the entry hall of the Congregation B'nai Israel in Milburn, New Jersey. Motherwell immediately seeks advice from Schapiro about the project. Quote, "I want to make something not only as beautiful, but as appropriate within my limitations as I can imagine for that congregation, not only for myself, but to justify as much as I can their trust in what must be an unknown artist and an unknown mode of expression. I find the whole enterprise moving in a way I cannot properly explain." Shapiro writes back and recommends books on Jewish history for Motherwell to read, and he advises him to do discrete individual images, not a narrative, which he ends up doing. He ends up doing discrete images. So in a sense, Schapiro never stopped being Motherwell's teacher. However, I don't want this story that I'm telling to become a one-way street of influence going from Schapiro to Motherwell. I would also like to think about what Motherwell showed back to Schapiro, what he demonstrated to Schapiro. This is rather a story of two great minds working out certain concepts or circling around certain concepts in tandem, in parallel, I would say. So let's return to that idea first iterated in the nature of abstract art, that is, that abstract art is a practical demonstration, not a theoretical one. I want to consider this in relation to Shapiro's later, more semiological writings from the late 1960s onward, especially his 1969 article on some problems in the semiotics of visual art, field and vehicle in image signs, one of my all-time favorite articles by Shapiro. In relation to Motherwell's open painting series from approximately 1967 to 1974, which, as we heard from Jennifer, were putatively inspired when the artist observed the edge of one of his paintings in front of another positioned next to an open window. Shapiro's article inspired many abstract painters, as is evinced by this show dedicated to it at the Studio School. Yet again, I should be clear here, I'm not arguing that this article is the urtext for understanding Motherwell's open paintings, or that there is any sort of direct causal connection. That is, Schapiro writes the article, Motherwell reads it, and then begins to illustrate Shapiro's ideas. Rather, I would say that Motherwell's paintings are monstrations in the etymological sense of the word, that is, showings or proofs of some of Shapiro's basic claims about field and frame. Listen to these quotes from Shapiro's article as we look at some of Motherwell's most important open paintings. Here's Schapiro. He starts out by saying, "We take for granted as indispensable means the rectangular form that the sheet of paper or the canvas takes. But such a field corresponds to nothing in nature or mental imagery, where the phantoms of visual memory come up in a vague, unbounded void." And this is, I'll just continue with Schapiro. "Besides the prepared ground, we tend to take for granted the regular margin and frame as essential features of the image. It is not commonly realized how late an invention is the frame. The frame belongs then to a space of the observer rather than the illusory three-dimensional world disclosed within and behind it. It is a finding and focusing device placed between the observer and the image. More recently, paintings have begun hung altogether unframed. The frameless modern picture explains, in a sense, the functions of the frame in older art. The frame was dispensable when painting ceased to represent deep space and became more concerned with expressive and formal qualities of the non-mimetic marks than with their elaboration into signs. If the painting once receded within the framed space, the canvas now stands out from the wall as an object in its own right, with a tangibly painted surface, whether of abstract themes or with representation which is prominently flat and shows the activity of the artist in pronounced lines and strokes or the high arbitrariness of the selected forms and colors. Our conception of frame as a regular enclosure isolating the field of representation from the surrounding surfaces does not apply to all frames. There are pictures and reliefs in which elements of the image cross the frame as if the frame were only a part of the background and existed in a simulated space behind the figure. Such crossings of the frame is often an expressive device. To conclude, I would like to say that I'm very interested in art historians' diagrams. It seems that they become a kind of necessary supplement to the written word. And it's interesting because in the letter to Arthur Danto that Tim showed earlier, Motherwell talks about diagrams as external, something external. The art historians, when an art historian turns to making diagrams, their writing pen transforms from a writing instrument into a kind of drawing instrument. They must find an image that demonstrates and shows instead of one that tells, or instead of a mode of telling. For me, then, it is here in this diagram that Shapiro comes closest to admitting that he, the teacher, has learned much from his most important student, Motherwell. And Motherwell, the model student, has created art that serves as a model for thought, not just for Shapiro, but for all of us. Thank you. And I just had one coda that I found this picture of Meyer Schapiro at Columbia, and it was taken by Robert Motherwell's wife, Renetta Pensold Motherwell, who was a photographer, and Meyer Schapiro outlived Robert Motherwell, but Renetta continued to visit Shapiro, and she's the one who took this picture shortly before Meyer Schapiro passed away. So the relationship continued. Thank you.